good morning, Glue Troopers. Max and Maxis Models here. And something I thought we'd talk about today is one of the only models to ever have two separate kits of it in different scales marketed with the exact same box art. And that's the former Comet, later Aurora, and today Atlantis, Grumman S2F Tracker. Now, just super quick, for those who are unfamiliar with the airplane, the Grumman S2F is technically an airplane that was designed after World War II and went into service in the early 50s as the Navy's first multi-engine dedicated anti-submarine airplane. But in reality, they had been playing with the idea since 1942. There's an early mock-up and the only picture I could ever find of it. Now, originally the Navy used single-engine aircraft for anti-submarine warfare, and particularly the Grumman AF Guardian. But because it was a single-engine airplane, they had to operate in hunter-killer packs, usually two airplanes, one with all the sonar gear and another one with the weapons. So the S2 made that problem go away. It was an all-in-one package. And I'm not really sure how this came to be, but Comet made the first one in 1:54 scale, and perhaps they just wanted to make something a little cheaper for a different price point. But then they, a year later in the mid-50s, made one in 1:111 scale, if I have this information correct. I can't verify that. But looking at the parts kit, it looks like one was just a downscaled version of the other one. And there are only about 4 companies that made the kit, but even though you see a lot of S2 kits out on the market, that's because the other kits were remarketed by Tallery and Revell and, of course, Aurora and now Atlantis. In fact, Atlantis still makes the 1:54 scale S2. The S2 was called the Stoof because if you spell out S2F, it reads Stoof. And it was just a nickname the crews gave it. The S stood for Scout. The 2 stood for the second Scout aircraft bought from Grumman because the Guardian was considered the first one. And then the F was a designator for Grumman. And then, of course, you had the subvariant types. Airplane was extremely successful. It was bought by many countries, especially for the anti-submarine role, which was originally intended for, but the airframe was so versatile that it was also turned into the C-1, which was a carrier onboard delivery aircraft, basically a carrier-based freighter. It was also turned into the E-1 Tracer, which was one of the early airborne early warning aircraft that the Navy had. And as a side note, given our interest in models, famous kit model designer and industrial stylist Tom Daniel, yes, that Tom Daniel, was actually a crew member on the S2F. He's the one that gave me a lot of the information about it. Here's some photos of him in his squadron. He actually served on active duty during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He served as a madman, magnetic anomaly detector, sonar man. That's the big magnet that hangs out of the tail of those anti-submarine aircraft to help detect large magnetic things in the ocean like, submarines. So TD, thank you for your service. Well, looping back to our original point, both Comet and Aurora reused the original artwork on both kits in different scales. Now, I'm not familiar offhand with any other kit model where the same artwork was used for the same type of model in different scales. I have seen artwork basically pilfered and repurposed, like Jack Linwood's famous F4U artwork being, shall we say, borrowed and amended for a kit by a completely different company. Naughty, naughty. But I just thought that was kind of an interesting little tidbit. And if you guys know of any box art that was used on different kits than the original, then, drop it down in the comment section. Hey guys, quick note. It just popped into my mind. When I was a kid, at the height of my model building, I lived in the Panhandle of Florida, so I used to see a lot of military training aircraft, especially Navy S2s that I believe were reclassified as S2Ts because they had been converted into trainers. They had ripped out all of the sonar gear and all that stuff, but the Navy owned them outright. They had plenty of them. They were big multi-engine airplanes, so they were kind of the natural follow-on to turn them into multi-engine trainers. I think they were based out of Corpus Christi, Texas. So I used to see those orange and white S2s fly over all the time. And also a lot of T-28 Trojans out of Pensacola. But point being that I was trying to remember why this airplane seemed so important to me for such a somewhat obscure aircraft. And I remembered that not only did I see him fly over all the time, but as you guys may recall from our conversation with Mark Matai, I brought up the point that my brother had the little Aurora 1:111 scale box art on his wall. It was one of them I used to stare at when I go down to his room and look at all the artwork. So just an extra little tidbit. Oh, wow. I just had another memory about the S2. When I was flight instructing in the 90s down in here in Jacksonville at Shields Aviation and just flying around this area in general, I used to see a bunch of old S2s off in the weeds that were waiting to be disposed of down by the Grumman facility in St. Augustine. And they still had the engines and props on them. I was thinking, those could have been restored, but, there weren't that many collectors that had the kind of money to restore a vintage airplane that were really interested in what was essentially a slightly obscure airplane. And let's just say it wasn't a glamorous airplane, although it was very much a hard working one. And later on, I noticed they were slowly disappearing. Turned out they were cleaned up and dropped off as, I believe, artificial reefs. Or maybe they were scrapped and recycled. I don't know. I heard they were turned into artificial reefs. But it's funny, this obscure little airplane, it's rattling around in the back of your brain and your memories, and it's not until you do something like this video you start to realize just how much crossover you had with it. How it's just one of those interesting little things. Okay, that's it. I'm done rambling. You guys take care, and as always, model on. This has been a Max's Models presentation.